and it will be made available on the website after this event, just for anyone either who attends can watch it later, or for those who couldn't make it along to one of these sessions. It'll be available on the website, as are all the other sessions. We changed the event from a Teams live event just to a normal Teams meeting based on the numbers that we expected to attend tonight, which means that you can either ask questions via the chat function, which oops, I thought I had an image showing it. It's the sort of small speech bubble towards the top right hand side of your screen, or you can ask questions by raising your sort of virtual hand, which is the sort of button next to the chat function, or simply just by waving on the screen. Although we would ask that you retain any questions until after the presentation, and we'll try to deal with as many questions as we can once the presentation's finished, and hopefully Judith, as he is, back, but Judith will probably chair that question and answer session when we get to the end. So the presenters tonight are Alistair Dawson, who's going to do the first part of the presentation. Alistair's the Roads, Bridges and Flooding Coordinator within Falkirk Council, and the sort of senior officer responsible for delivery of the Grangemouth Flood Protection Scheme. Followed by Alistair will be my colleague Richard Meeson from Jacobs, and Richard's the engineering lead for the project. And as you can guess, I'm not Judith. I'm Alan McGowan, and I'm also from Jacobs, and I'm the design and consents manager for the project. So I'll just hand over to Alistair to begin the presentation.
Thanks, Alan, and welcome to everybody who's joined us this evening. Yeah, just as shown on the contents page here, there's a few different sections that we'll work through this evening. There'll be a number of slides for each section we'll work through, and as Alan has said, we will pick up on any questions that come forward towards the end. That slide in itself is fairly self-explanatory. It's a bit of background, bit of development to the scheme, the construction phase, and a bit more about further community involvement. Next slide, please, Alan. So the first section is going to focus on the background to the scheme, what we've been doing up until now, and some of the information that drives a major flood protection scheme, such as the Grangemouth scheme. So we'll highlight a bit about our previous engagement processes with the public, and a little bit about the flood risk which affects the Grangemouth area. Next slide, please, Alan. So, as you can see from this timeline, the development of the Grangemouth Flood Protection Scheme began sort of 5-6 years ago, when we began gathering some of the information required, both topographic information for the levels of the rivers and the surrounding land and the properties that are affected in the periphery and in the vicinity, of the scheme, and a lot of the initial information gathering and ecological surveys and things. There were a number of options appraised through 2017, 2018 into 2019, and as part of that, there were previous consultation events, which were public face-to-face events held within the Grangemouth and Carnshaw areas, and some of the decisions that were made at those through those consultation events have helped to shape the outline design that's currently in development. As you can see with the red dotted line down that plan, we're still in that outline development phase, and there are a number of community engagement sessions planned for the remainder of this year and into next year. But all this is leading up to what's the more formal legal process involved in taking forward any flood protection scheme, and that is the scheme notification process, which we expect to commence around about the middle of next year, hopefully. When the scheme is notified, all affected landowners will be notified, and there will be an opportunity for people to put in comments or objections to the scheme, and those will be dealt with in a normal manner before the scheme is confirmed and then we go into the more detailed design and procurement of contractors to take the scheme forward. So as you can see, it's going to be a number of years before we even commence construction works. We anticipate it's going to be around about 2025 before there are any construction works at all. And that construction period may last somewhere between 5 and 10 years. And as we go forward over these next few years, we'll be continuing to develop the procurement strategy and the construction methodology for each part of the project. Next slide, please. So just as I touched on the previous consultation events, just a brief recap on some of the feedback that we did receive. The event in 2018, one of the key significant parts of that consultation was around the defences along the Grange Burn and the area of Zetland Park. Probably its most significant feedback was around how the defences would be aligned and what parts of the park would be protected or not protected. The majority of people that voted looked at the option that reduced the requirement for defences along the upper part of Grange Burn. So we have no defences between Zetland Park and upstream towards Rannoch Park. And the defence alignment around Zetland stays quite close to the perimeter to the edge of the Grange Burn itself, rather than the alternative that went around the periphery of the park. In addition, through both consultation events, there was requests for more information and to be kept informed. So we've launched our new website and launched social media channels. We're constantly updating the website with more information, including the frequently asked questions section and some of the previous options that were considered. And we'll touch on some of those later on in tonight's session as well. And obviously there was a request for further engagement sessions. Obviously with COVID over the last year and a bit, so 15, 16 months or so, it's been really difficult to get it into communities and to engage face to face. But we wanted to have some engagement sessions and set up this series of events. We had 4 events last week and we've got another 3 this week, looking at different areas of the scheme and trying to get into each of those community areas and make sure people are more and more aware of what is planned and what's proposed in each of those specific areas. So if we can have the next slide, please, Alan. Just wanted to touch on, what is the source of flood and what is the risk to Grangemouth and the surrounding towns. So this graphic demonstrates first of all, the areas along the foreshore and the lower part of each of the 3 watercourses, which is highlighted in the sort of orangey yellow colour. And these areas are all affected by tidal or coastal flood risk. The lower part of each of those 3 watercourses, the River Avon, the Grange Burn and the River Carron, are all tidal rivers, and those extent of those rivers are all affected by tidal impacts. But you can also see then further upstream, the Carron extending up as far as Stenishmuir towards Larbert, the Grange Burn heading up towards West Quarter, and the River Avon heading towards Polmont and Linlithgow side. These parts of the rivers are more impacted by fluvial flooding when there's a rainfall event in the upper part of the catchment of those watercourses, and all that water gathers and comes into the streams and into the burns and into the river and makes its way downstream, and can have a fluvial flood risk on those communities alongside each of those different watercourses. So if we look at the next slide, this then just demonstrates those areas that could be affected by flooding, either by fluvial or by coastal flooding. And you can see that the extent of the areas at risk is quite extensive. Sometimes people in these communities maybe haven't been directly affected by flooding in recent times and maybe don't appreciate that there is a flood risk there. They do live close to the estuary or close to one of these watercourses and maybe don't fully appreciate the level of risk. This slide shows what is known as a 1 in 200 year flood extent. And we're aware that obviously the terminology is a little bit difficult to grasp. So 1 in 200 year does not mean that there will only be one event every 200 years that gets to this extent. It simply talks about the probability of any flood event reaching these kind of water levels. and the guidance talks about a low risk, a medium risk, and a high risk. And a 1 in 200 year event is a medium risk event, with a probability of 0.5% in any particular rainfall event that the water levels could reach these levels and reach into these communities. And these plans are also available on the website if anybody would like to spend a little bit more time looking at specific areas. Certainly be able to go in and look at the same information through the website. Thanks, Alan. So what we've done here then is, again, shown in blue is the same extent of the same area that's shown in the previous plan, but the green areas are those additional areas which would be affected with climate change. So climate change could obviously impact the level of the tides and seawater levels. So those tidal areas could be affected more dramatically, and water levels could extend further into the residential community in the middle of Grangemouth, closer to Shira Park, Grangemouth Stadium, some of the residential areas around Zetland Park as well. And if we just look at the next slide as well, which obviously shows the western side of the scheme, mainly along the River Carron, you can see the areas of floodplain in blue, but the additional areas of floodplain in green, when a larger rainfall event affects the watercourse and there's more water coming down from the hills, obviously the potential for that water to spill into those adjacent communities increases. And just to put it into perspective, at the current time, the number of properties who are affected by a 1 in 200 year flood event sits around 3,000. That's both residential and commercial properties. But by the time climate change effects are taken into consideration, the number of properties rises from 3,000 to almost 6,000 properties that are at risk of flooding. So you can see that the number of properties and the damage that would be caused to all those properties is quite extensive. And that's really why we're looking at progressing a protection scheme that will offer that resilience to these communities. And just finally, before I hand over to Richard, this slide just demonstrates just some of the stakeholders that we're consulting with. As you might expect for a scheme of the scale and complexity of the Grangemouth scheme, there's a wide range of interested parties that need to be kept informed. And this slide just kind of groups those into some key areas. It certainly doesn't list every single stakeholder that we're consulting with, but it just kind of demonstrates some of the key areas that we're engaging with. As I showed on the previous slide with the timeline, and we'll mention it a few times this evening, there are a number of engagement sessions planned throughout this year and into next year, with the aim of just raising awareness and making sure everybody's fully informed of what the proposals for the scheme are. So there will be further opportunities for communities and businesses and others to get involved. I really would encourage you to spread the word into those communities and speak to your neighbours and any other groups that you're involved in these communities, to encourage them to look at the website and come along to any of the events that we hold. So to take you through the next section, I'm going to hand across to Richard and just begin speaking a little bit about the development of the scheme. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you, Alistair. I'm just going to talk through firstly kind of some of the options that we've considered and discounted, then move into more about the flood defences themselves, so how they look and the different types. Then I've got some plans to go through which relate to the scheme and kind of where we're proposing to put structures, and then I'll touch on some of the environmental impacts, and I'll then move into more examples really about flood protection schemes. So next slide please, Alan. So there's a number of different ways in which we can offer flood protection. I mean, not all the solutions are going to be practical or viable. There's a number of factors, I suppose, we need to consider. Alistair's mentioned the source of flooding being tidal and fluvial, so from the watercourse or from the Firth of Forth. If there's enough space on the banks to construct some of these structures, the presence of underground and above ground pipelines or utilities. So on the slide here, give you some of the examples of options that we have considered and also discounted for various reasons through the option appraisal process. So I'm just going to run through them. So the diverting flows, I meant due to the large flows for a 200-year event on the River Carron and the River Avon particularly, it's not really a viable option. You need quite very, very large channels. We don't have space. The topography is also very flat, so it's not something that's going to work. There is also a number of above and below ground pipelines that make it impractical here. The runoff control, which is something you might have heard of, natural flood management, and that's about kind of having to look at the catchment as a whole, and actually trying to control the water at source, so kind of up in the braes. I mean, again, the river catchment for the Avon and the Carron are quite large. It's not really practical on this scale to change the land use, so that's why that option hasn't been progressed, especially for the larger watercourses. Flood storage is an option that we did consider. We spent some time actually during the option appraisal process. We looked at 2 storage areas actually on the River Carron, and actually one off the West Quarterburn, which would impact the Grangeburn. So the ones on the Carron, again, we looked at 2 quite large areas. Again, they were deemed impractical, more due to the presence of major accident hazard pipelines that ran through one of the storage areas in particular, but also the overhead electrical cables ran through one of the other ones. I meant, just to give you some context, the major accident hazard pipeline was for the National Grid and SGN. These pipelines you can't just move out to put other, I suppose, people or houses at risk. So to move these 2 pipelines was kind of deemed impractical because there wasn't a suitable alternative location to move them to, and also with the electrical cables, these are transmission lines, and speaking to Scottish Power, these take probably 10 years plus to plan, and the cost of them was considerable as well. And again, the storage area that we did explore on the West Quarterburn, again, there was oil and gas pipelines going through them, and again, there wasn't anywhere safe that we could divert them to, and yet there was also overhead electricity cables in the area as well. So we also looked at dredging or sediment management, which again really would only impact certain parts of the watercourses, as Alistair's mentioned. It would more impact the lower part of the Grangeburn, part of the Avon, and the lower section of the River Carron. It wouldn't have any impact really on the fluvial aspect there. But again, because the watercourses, as I mentioned, are tidal, having to dredge has very little impact. Every 12 hours, the North Sea comes in, potentially then could be having to, I suppose, fill the area that you've dredged. It's also kind of, I suppose, not a sustainable activity, but also kind of could be quite destructive to the environment. So I'll just quickly touch on to a barrier or gate. We did explore installing a tidal gate or barrier at the mouth of the Grangeburn, and this was primarily to stop the North Sea more or less having to back up the Grangeburn, which we could do. One thing we need to be aware of is that there's still water coming down the Grangeburn as well. And when we looked into this in a bit more detail, we found out actually that we could be increasing the flood risk to Grangemouth town by when our barrier is closed, so we get a high tide event and we need to close it. We need to be conscious of, if we have a rainstorm event at the same time, that more water could be coming down the Grangeburn, and with the barrier being closed, it wouldn't be able to go out through the mouth of the channel, and actually could overtop the banks and actually cause more flooding in Grangemouth town. And property level of protection means that we have looked into. It's just that the depth of flooding through most of the scheme is beyond kind of what property level of protection is suitable for. Property level of protection is kind of what it says, what it looks like in the picture there. So it's having to put kind of temporary gates or gates that can be installed in a short period of time across doorways, or you can have them over air bricks around your house, and it's really to stop the flood water having to enter the building. But again, they kind of only work normally for low depth, low depths of flooding. Next slide, please. Alan, has that changed on your screen?
It has changed on my screen.
Yeah, it's changed on mine as well, Richard. It's the flood defence type, so hopefully that's
Alistair?
changed for everybody else.
It's not came through, Richard, no.
Hopefully everyone can see the title, the slide titled Flood Defences. This shows kind of, I suppose, what the flood defences can look like. That they can take for many forms, predominantly kind of wall structures or earth embankments. I mean, I'm just going to talk you through them. I mean, the defences can, I suppose, look there's quite a varying degree of how they can look at the end of the day. At the bottom left-hand side, we've got exposed sheet pile, which might be more suitable for the industrial areas where the structures won't be publicly available to be seen. Moving up to the top left is a concrete flood wall that has actually got a patterned or a line has been used, so it's like a mould. And for this one there, it's kind of a mould that's kind of like I suppose brick, or not brick, stonework kind of wall as such. And there's hundreds of different moulds that can be picked there. Moving over to the right side, we've got a stone. The bottom right is a stone clad wall. So again, it's a concrete flood wall, and there is actually stone then kind of fixed onto the surface of the wall. And there's also kind of been a railing has actually been installed there on top of the wall, probably from a safety aspect, is that there's quite a drop on the watercourse side of it. Moving up to top right, we've got a flood embankment, and again, flood embankments typically, I suppose, are planted up. They can have amenity grassland on, or they can have a wildflower mix put onto them. You can also put footpaths on them. So there's lots of different ways that we can try and, I suppose, not just mean it's a flood embankment, but to landscape into the local environment. And lastly, we've got a floodgate in the middle there. We try to, I suppose, design out floodgate structures. So if we can use a ramp to go over our flood wall or flood embankment, we will do. But like this picture, you've got a floodgate. The flood defences obviously go across a road, and the road needs to stay open. So a floodgate has been installed there. I mean, it's worth just having to note that that one there is quite a large one in height wise, and also kind of the width of the road and everything else, that they are quite large structures. And once they are closed, then the road would be, you wouldn't be able to drive along that section of the road, which would mean once the flood event has passed, also the gate would need to be opened again. So it's something we do have as part of the scheme design some floodgates, but where we can, we are trying to design them out as well. Next slide, please. So this slide will cover the flood defences that are being proposed for cell 1, which is the upper Karen. This covers, I'm just going to run through kind of some of where they are really. So we've got flood defences along Stirling Road, kind of along the north bank and intermittently along the south bank around some of the properties there. And then we work our way down. We've got a flood embankment round by Park Road there, and then we've got flood defences kind of around Stenhouse and the new Karen Road Bridge, and along the boundary of the properties for Beaumont Drive there, probably the first 8 or so. and then we kind of come down past the care home. We've got a flood wall proposed along, again, the top of bank, so where the fences are at the moment, the boundary fences, from the care home up to the chapel burn and along the footpath there as well. And then we come down to the Dock Street or Caronshaw area, and we've got a flood wall there proposed, again, at the top of bank. Moving on to cell 2. This covers the lower Carron, which covers really, I suppose, the Glensborough and into the port of Grangemouth area. So we've got a flood embankment that ties in with the high ground at the canal entrance. And this continues where, I suppose, the Charlotte Dundas path is now. And then we kind of have a flood wall going along through the Jarvie plant site and around some of the warehouses there, and kind of through or around the rear of the Grangemouth Yacht Club and into kind of the old nearby the Grangemouth old school building. And the defences here actually they stop as such, but they actually tie into the next cell, which is cell 3 in the port. So we'll move on to cell 3. So again, we've got a continuous flood wall structure proposed along in this cell, so parallel to North Shore and South Shore Road. And this goes all the way around the perimeter of the port. It's worth having just take a little bit of time to note that we've got a flood wall going through the main lock entrance to the port. We are doing a port study at present to determine what kind of structure we're going to be installing in the lock. We are aware that that's the only entrance in and out of the port, so it's a key kind of part to the scheme. So one thing here is that the lock gates, we need to raise the height of the lock gates to make sure that if we do get a 1 in 200 year tidal event, we can actually hold back the water, so from a height point of view, but structurally we need to make sure that the lock gates at the moment, they're designed as though the water in the port is higher than the water level out in the Firth of Forth. So structurally we need to do some work to them as well to make sure if it's the other way around that the gates can withstand that force. And also we need to be conscious of this is an operational port, so there is going to be for vessels kind of using that lock as well. So that kind of makes it a bit more, I suppose, interesting from a construction aspect as well, and how we build it and the time it's going to take to build it as well. So we're just kind of moving to cell 4, which we split into 2 parts. So cell 4 covers the Grange Burn. This is kind of the north part. So we've got a flood embankment which starts near the play park in Zetland Park, and we have an embankment going through Zetland Park to the kiosk, where then it transitions into a flood wall. And then we continue down Park Road with a flood embankment on the top of bank, and down Grangeburn Road as well. The flood wall for Grangeburn Road will be positioned on the top of bank to reduce, I suppose, the overall height of the wall, and the defences there continue off into the industrial petrol for chemical plant. It's worth, I suppose, noting there both the defence there won't stop there. It ties into cell 6, which we'll come to in a minute. But on the other side of the road there, we've got a flood defence that starts just north of the leisure centre, and again it's for parallel to Abbots Road and South Shore Road, again at the edge of road for top of bank. But we've got a flood wall to go down there continuously, and that we have identified a number of gates there at the roads and footbridges as well. And the southern part of cell 4 covers kind of the Bean Cross area, Millhall Burn, and also the flood relief channel. The blue star indicates that we're proposing a flow control structure on the Grange Burn. So what we're trying to do here is make better use really of the flood relief channel by actually controlling how much flow goes down the Grange Burn, and then the rest, when we get an extreme event, the majority of flow from the west quarter and the Pullman Burns will actually be diverted into the flood relief channel and down and out into the River Avon. A consequence of kind of, I suppose, of having to force more water down the flood relief channel is that we need to build a flood wall or an embankment, a structure kind of along the north bank really to stop water having to spill out and flow north into the urban area of Grangemouth town area, or the urban area there. So that's why we've got, you can see a flood wall or an embankment kind of along part of the flood relief, or most of the flood relief channel, and also down at Smithy Bray and for Reddock Road area, we've got the Millhall Burn. So again, we know that it's influenced by the Avon and by the flood relief channel as well, but there's also a flood risk of the Millhall Burn can kind of overtop its banks and come out and flood properties there. So that's why there is a flood wall shown there that kind of is there to protect those properties. So moving into cell 5, this covers more or less continuously. We've got continuous flood defences from north of Hull Flats Road. This is all through the industrial petrochemical plant complex. The defences to the south of Hull Flats Road are there to really stop the River Avon having to flood over Hull Flats Road, which would close the road. So that's why they're there. That's why there's a bit there. But basically, these defences, where they both finish at the mouth of the Avon, they actually tie in with the flood defences for cell 6. So it is continuous here, the structures, and this is cell 6. So again, we've got defences. So kind of at the western kind of end there, they tie into the defences from cell 4, and we go along the estuary frontage here with a flood wall. It's worth having to note that the Firth of Forth is a special protected area, so this is a particularly sensitive environmental area, and it's something that I'll come on to put in the next slide. And also kind of down at Kinneil on the eastern section here, we've got a flood embankment that goes around by the Kinneil and the wastewater treatment works there, and kind of then ties into high ground towards the south kind of east, I suppose, part. Next slide, please. So the environment is, I suppose, a key consideration when we are developing a flood protection scheme. Alistair's already mentioned, but a number of environmental surveys have been carried out over the last 5 years, and this all kind of feeds information into the environmental impact assessment, which we are producing. The survey information provides the project team with particular information about different species and about how they could be impacted by the scheme really over a short, a medium, or a long term. Where possible, we are trying to avoid any impacts. That's not always possible, so then we need to look at appropriate for mitigation that we can adopt that will reduce that impact. I suppose it's also worth having to note here that we are aware of our carbon, our carbon footprint of a scheme, and we are having to look to reduce that where we can. And it's worth also having to note here at the box at the bottom of the slide there is that we are also trying to look for opportunities. So where the scheme can actually offer enhancement, or not just we're not just having to mitigate our impact, but we can actually improve things that are there. So maybe where we can change like the land use, or encourage more biodiversity by improving the landscape, or creating, say, wildflower areas. That's something we're trying to encourage in the scheme design. It may well be that it also comes into that we can produce more footpaths or for cycle paths. So we're trying to kind of look to make sure that the scheme is more than just a flood protection scheme. We're trying to enhance kind of the area as well where we can do. So the next few slides I'm going to just quickly go through, kind of, I suppose, are a bit more graphical about, and we're going through kind of what we're going to build and how we build it. So showing some examples of construction works. We've got a little bit of a before and after, which is quite good because it shows you kind of how the scheme could look and how long it maybe would take to kind of look kind of to a similar site now. And then we've just got some examples really of some flood protection schemes in Scotland. So moving on to building, it may seem that the height of the wall or the height of an embankment isn't particularly large above ground, but one thing having to worth to note here is that there is major engineering works that are kind of underground as such, so you don't always see that. The flood defences, any of them, an embankment or a wall, they need to be able to cope or withstand a significant impact. So one, we need to make sure that they can withstand the force of the water, but we also need to make sure that the foundations are strong enough to deal with any floating debris in flood water. This may mean trees or cars that are floating down, but we need to make sure that we can the structures can withstand that impact. We need to make sure that, I suppose, fundamentally the height of the structure is high enough above the flood event that we're trying to protect against, but we need to make sure that flood water won't kind of seep through the structure, say for an embankment. And we also need to be aware that flood water could go under our structure. So that's why the two pictures on the two top pictures do show sheet piles having to go down considerably below the embankment and wall. And that's to make sure that we don't have water having to seep under them. That would otherwise end up with flood water on our potentially the dry side of the flood wall or embankment. I mean the bottom pictures, you've got on the bottom right there, you've got an embankment next to the watercourse. Bottom left is a flood wall with a railing on top, and the middle one there, it just gives you an idea about the sheet piles in the ground that you don't really actually see because there's a reinforced a concrete stem actually that's going to be built above ground there. Sorry, next slide. So this slide moves into kind of, I suppose, how we build it. I'll just take you through the pictures here. So the top left shows construction works. They've actually the contractor here has actually created a temporary working area within the watercourse. So you can see the ground actually in front of the wall, that they've created that as an access point, and that's where they're going to be. And the new I suppose concrete flood wall there, you can see it. Again, it's just to give you an idea about how much space we need to work. The top middle picture is installing sheet piles next to a road, and you can see the rig there is actually going along and installing them in a line. But again, it's just the context of it's not just a metre or two. We are having to talk a 5 to 10 metre zone as such for construction plant and kind of for space to build. Top right is an embankment that's being formed next to a road. But again, it just shows how much space you need for an excavator to be able to track next to the structure, then compact the material that has been installed there. The pictures on the bottom left and the bottom right are actually taken at the same place. So one is, I mean, we are having to build flood protection schemes here. So it kind of does what it says it's going to do. We're working near the watercourses and they will flood. So the picture on the bottom right shows like the contractor having to work in a temporary for working area, which was part of the watercourse there. You can also see kind of they've installed some sheet piles as like a temporary dam actually to allow them to work in the dry for most of the time. But if we do get a flood event, the water actually has overtopped the sheet piles and flooded the construction area. So I mean that is a potential risk during the construction, as we are having to work near the watercourses for a significant length of time as well. The bottom middle picture, I mean, just shows the bottoms of the sheet piles having to come out the ground there and the reinforcement kind of being installed. It's worth having to note, I mean, the construction works will be undertaken really by an experienced contractor with a track record of building flood protection schemes. We won't be, I suppose, constructing all the flood defences at once, so we will be having to work in discrete kind of areas. All the works will be, I suppose, controlled and monitored by the project team to ensure compliance. Health and safety, are our primary consideration for both the workforce, but also for the public as well. So we will need to make sure that the working areas are secure areas. And again, it just goes back to how much space we need. We need to make sure that there is enough space there that the contractor actually can build this in a safe way as well. But all I would say is that, Alistair's mentioned about ongoing consultation and engagement with the communities. That's something we need to do, and we are going to be doing more and more of. He's also mentioned that the construction phasing of this works is like potentially 4 or 5 years away. So all this stuff is something that we don't know all the answers yet, but it's something that we are going to be engaging with everyone over the next few months and years. Next slide, please. This slide is kind of what we classed as a bit before and after. It's from the White Cart Flood Protection Scheme in Glasgow. So the two pictures on the left-hand side are from 2008, before any works took place. The middle two pictures are 2012, so more or less we class it as maybe the day one post construction work, so when the flood wall has been installed. And the two pictures on the far right are from 2020, and you can see how, one, the flood wall won't look quite so shiny over the years, but also the vegetation has started to grow back. So if you take the bottom three pictures there, you can see in 2008 the trees there are quite large and the road's actually quite dark. You can't actually see where the watercourse is. It's actually kind of to the left of the trees there. You can clearly see in 2012 all the trees have been felled, a new flood wall has been built there. It's quite light and open. But in 2020, it's worth having to note, I suppose, in 2012, trees were planted on the wet side of the flood wall. But you can see by 2020, the trees have grown considerably, but they're nowhere near as large as they were in 2008. And the street actually is considerably more light now as well. So that just gives you an example about how long things might take to I suppose, how long trees might take to grow back. All I would say is here with the White Cart scheme, these were whips that were planted. With the Grangemouth Flood Protection Scheme, we are having to look to plant larger trees to start with. So I wouldn't think it's going to be an 8-year gap between to get the trees back to some sort of size. I would like to think it would be a bit for less than that as well. But it's just to give you an idea about how things can change over a reasonably short period of time. The flood defences are, I suppose, designed to last 100 years plus. So kind of within an 8 years time here, you've gone from having not a lot of vegetation to having a significant amount now of trees and for vegetation back. Next slide. So this just gives some examples really of flood protection schemes in Scotland, just to show, I suppose, what can be done. So the top left is from Brecon, and it's just a highlight really, I suppose. Here there was community artwork that was installed in the flood wall. So that's kind of trying to get the community to have maybe a sense of ownership there, that they actually had an input into the structures and how it was going to look at the end of the day. The bottom left is from the Selkirk Flood Protection Scheme. And again, you've got a flood wall kind of in the background there. You've got planting. You've also got a footpath kind of on the left-hand side of the pitch there on top of an embankment. So again, it's not just a flood wall or an embankment. They've tried to turn an embankment into a footpath, so it's an access way. So it's just trying to give you that it's not just about the hard engineering structures. The two pictures in the middle from the White Cart scheme, again, it's just to show that how walls can be maybe changed, how they look, to kind of integrate them more into the local environment. The top middle there is kind of where a flood wall's been built, and it's very close to the residential garden. So new fence has been installed, but it just to kind of show how it could look, I suppose. And the two pictures on the right there, again from the White Cart scheme, but it's just to show kind of a flood wall with a railing on top next to a road, and how it could look afterwards. And the top right there is just, again, it's the white cart scheme, but it's the vegetation on the bankament from once post-construction work. That would have, some trees would have been planted, but again, how the vegetation of the bank has naturally taken over there, so it won't ever stay kind of bare as such. It will grass back quite quickly. And I think now I'm going to hand you back to Alistair to go through the last few slides.
Excuse me. Thanks, Richard. Thanks a lot for that. Yeah, so just to kind of touch on what we've referred to a few times this evening, tonight's event is part of a series that are being held this week and next week. It builds on the previous consultation exercises that we held in 2018 and 2019, and there will be further events planned both through this year and into next year. And indeed, even as we go forward into construction phase, there will be ongoing methods of communication between the project team and the local communities to make sure everybody's familiar with the impacts that that construction phase may have on individual communities. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, it's been difficult to have face-to-face meetings over the last year, but we do hope to have public exhibition probably in the springtime after Christmas, where there will hopefully be an opportunity for the communities to drop in and discuss any issues with the project team. And sitting alongside that, we also have a STEM educational programme, which we're already developing with colleagues in the education department. So we'll be working with both the primary school and the high schools as part of the school curriculum. And there will be opportunities through that, both for some competitions that we hope that the winners of those competitions can be announced and be part of a science festival that's planned for Zetland Park next year. But also will be opportunities as we go forward through the project for some educational visits when there's activity on site for those school children to come down and see the actual experience, the site in action. We're aware that, as it's shown on the right-hand side of this slide, there are a huge number of other projects ongoing within the Falkirk Council area, and particularly in some of the areas affected by this scheme. We've only listed 3 or 4 of them here, but there are many other projects ongoing, and there's a real need, something we're working quite closely with colleagues across the council to ensure we have this coordinated approach, that where possible, improvements that are required or intended as part of one project are complementary to other projects that might come along in the future, and that we don't go in and undo some of the good work that's being done by other teams. So there's lots of work going on behind the scenes to ensure that the different strands of work that are done by the council, whether that's the annual year-to-year stuff that gets done anyway, or some of the larger special projects that are proposed in the local vicinity, are all well coordinated. And obviously, as we move into those construction phases, there will be opportunities both for local people, that may be some of the school children that are involved in the STEM programme at the moment. By the time we get to construction, they may have an opportunity to gain employment through the project, but other local people as well, and also local suppliers will have opportunities to be part of that project and feed into the wider supply chain. But essentially, I want to come back to the box in the middle of this slide, which is a lot about what the feedback we're looking from both tonight's event and the feedback forms that will be issued after this evening's event, and also any future events that we hold throughout the rest of this year. There are huge opportunities for the community to be involved and be engaged in this project, and actually to feedback and be part of the development of the project. We've already shown some of these things this evening in terms of the wall finishes. There may be a new path network that would be a benefit to the community if there's a desire to have walking and cycling in particular areas, and that's difficult at the moment. If you tell us about that, it could well be that we can incorporate some of these new paths or links into the project. Certainly in terms of landscaping and seating, it's relatively straightforward to incorporate the thoughts of the communities into the development of the scheme around these areas. And as Richard showed on one of the slides, there's opportunities for public art to be part of these projects. Probably less so around the foreshore and the port area, but certainly within the more community areas in Carron Shore, along the Grange Barn and Rannoch Park as well. There's huge opportunities for public art to be incorporated into parts of the project. So really would encourage you to come forward with any ideas, and not just around these things. If there's other things that there's a burning desire within communities to have other features or other activities included as part of the project, we can look to incorporate that. There's certainly plenty of time to have that discussion and bring that into the project. Next slide, please. Just a couple of final slides from myself before we go to the floor to open up for questions. As I've mentioned a few times, we're looking for these sessions at the moment to help develop that community engagement process. We're looking for that feedback from people to see what areas of the project they want to know more about. There are a number of individual community-focused sessions being held last week and this week, where more detail in each of those community areas is being shared with those individual community residents. So, the information we get back from these sessions is really, really important, that we can then help to tailor future sessions and to deal with the questions and the concerns that any of those communities may have. So we will be having continued sessions throughout the rest of this year. And as I've mentioned already, a public exhibition in the springtime. And all of this activity is really gearing up towards the formal process, which is a legal process under the Flood Risk Management Act, where we need to go and notify all the affected landowners and invite objections from everybody. Hopefully there won't be too many, because we'll hopefully have used the engagement process to tease out some of those areas of concern and being able to deal with those in advance. But that really comes down to getting people out to these events to learn more about the project from the project team, and not take hearsay, but maybe hearing on the street, but actually come and get the information firsthand from the project team. So really would encourage people to come along to all the events that we hold and engage with us. And at that, I'd just like to go to the last slide, which is really just a reminder of last two slides, a reminder of the events we're holding. This is the events we've already held last week. The two focus sessions this week are on the Rannoch Park area and the Flood Relief Channel tomorrow night, and on the Millhall Burn and Old Polmont area, Smitty Bray, on Thursday night. And just the very last slide is a reminder of our website and our email address and our social media channels, where you can continue to gain information. And as I said earlier, the maps that have been shared earlier are available through the website, and all the sessions that we're holding last week and this week will be put up on the website in due course. So Judith, if I can maybe just hand over to yourself, and you can take us through any of the questions that are coming in and any more questions that people would like to ask.
Yep, good evening everyone. Apologies about the technical difficulties for those that were at the start, and if there was anyone that had that last week as well, we're doing our best with this technology thing, and we just can't wait to come out and see you in Grangemouth. It'll be just so much better in person. I think we're almost there. So we've had one question. Obviously, this is a massive scheme and will take years to build, as your programme suggests. Is there a way to ensure that having built one section of the defence, it does not impact other areas during a flooding event?
This one, do you want me to take that, Alistair?
Thanks, Richard.
Yep. So, when we get into the detail of the construction, having to phase the works, we need to be mindful that we're not going to be increasing the flood risk as a consequence of the construction works. So, ideally you work at the bottom of your watercourse upwards, but that might not always be practical for various reasons. So the short answer is, we're aware of that, and that is something that we need to be considering during the construction of the works. But we're kind of, I suppose, months to years away from actually what that's going to mean, like where we're going to be for how long. But that's one reason why we kind of work, I suppose, in discrete areas. We won't be doing 27 kilometres in a one-er. It will be having to work over 200-300 metre length, say, to make sure that we can control that risk if we do get an extreme event during the construction works.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've touched on it as well earlier on. The construction period is likely to be quite considerable. We're saying between 5 and 10 years in total. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be in one of those communities for any longer than we need to be. The sequence of works will be phased such that we're minimising the disruption in each individual community. As you'll have seen from the plans earlier, there's quite a lot of defences along the foreshore and around the port area where there's very little public access other than people who work in those areas. And when we're in community areas, we'll continue the engagement to make sure all those communities are well aware of the timings and the processes that are involved and what the implications of each of those construction contracts may be on those community areas. There could well be temporary traffic management arrangements or other arrangements for parts of that construction phase, and those will be well communicated to people in advance.
Okay, Ricky got back and said thanks, that makes sense, which is great. There's no other questions on the chat there, but if anyone else in the session has a question, they can use the chat, or you'll see at the top there's a little face with a hand. You're very welcome to hit that as well if you'd rather just put your hand up.
I think everybody's shy tonight. Either that or there's somewhere to be.
Yeah, it's the sun shining, isn't it? Tempting us out.
Get ready for football at 8 o'clock.
Hmm.
I'm sure there's more questions out there.
As Alistair had said, we'll be sending a feedback form out after, but equally we're going to take the questions that have been asked in the other sections and put them on our website as well. If in the feedback form, if you come to a question later on, say in the middle of the game at halftime or something, feel free to put it in the feedback form, and we'd hope to get back to you as well.
And just to clarify, those feedback forms are being emailed out after the session, or will it be tomorrow then those are sent out?
Yeah, we can do it after the session. That's no problem at all.
Brilliant, thank you.
Oh, just a small point from somebody. Just saying, I guess in one of the slides, the bonus is spelt wrong, which should be a capital N. Apologies about that. That's really annoying when things like that happen. Oh, one more question here. Are there opportunities for integrating, say, active travel routes alongside parts of the scheme? Great question.
Yeah, that's certainly one of the areas where we're keen to get feedback from communities. There are already some ideas within different council departments and some of the communications, the engagement sessions different people have been having with individual communities about some areas that could have improved active travel links. I think across the Falkirk area we're actually not too bad for walking and cycling facilities, but there's always opportunities to build on that and to improve that. So we will be looking at active travel and seeing where there are opportunities to expand that. Certainly one of the sessions we had last week along Grangeburn, that was one of the questions that came up, excuse me, specifically for Grangeburn Road and access to the riverbank in that area. So that's something that we'll continue to discuss with that community. And there may well be other opportunities across the scheme area for enhancements that we can look at. So any ideas are more than welcome to put them down in the feedback form, and if there's specific locations or just more generally, we can certainly investigate that and build that into the proposals.
Okay, any other questions out there?
As Julie said, if anybody wants to raise a hand or give us a wave and just ask your question in the normal way, using your voice rather than typing it in, I can certainly take them that way as well.
Here's another one. There are large areas of open ground in Grangemouth in the parks. Adjacent to much of the works, will these be worked into the scheme as resources of last resort for overflow?
Take that one if you want. So,
Yeah.
I mean, yes, there are a number of parks in Grangemouth or in the scheme area. We are actually trying, I suppose, utilise parks in an extreme event that we aren't really protecting any of the parks there. We are, with the exception of for Zetland Park, which during the option appraisal stage and through consultation that we've had to date, the alignment we've gone through is the alignment that is what people wanted. But say for Rannoch Park, yes, in an extreme event, the park kind of will flood, and we've got a flood wall kind of along Rannoch Road there. Again, parks generally in urban areas are kind of large green spaces. So they're in a way they're areas that I suppose you'd rather flood a park than a property. And it's something that we are aware of, and we haven't gone and protected big parks and green spaces really. We have kind of let them flood as they're in the floodplain anyway. And yeah, I suppose it's a simple area. Is that it's a choice between having to flood that or flood an urban area more. And I think a park is probably an area you'd be more content to let flood for a short period of time.
Okay, any more questions?
Final call for questions. We'll maybe wrap it up shortly. Anybody wants to give us a wave, put the hand up, or type a question? No? Okay. I'll maybe just wrap things up, Judith, if that's okay then.
Yep.
Just like to say thank you to the team that helped with the presentation this evening, particularly to Judith, Richard and Alan for us impromptu stepping in. There's another question come in, so that was more a comment, it's not a question, that's fine. So thanks to everybody for attending. As I said, there will be feedback forms come out, so look forward to hearing any thoughts that any of you have that you haven't been able to ask this evening, or any ideas that you have for taking the scheme forward, to continue the engagement. And as I said, it's a really important part of the project to make sure that we're speaking to as many people as possible. So please, I'd ask you to spread the word as far as you can, and look forward to speaking to everybody again in the future. So thank you very much, everybody. I think, Alan, you can stop the recording. Everybody's leaving, so we can just stop the recording now. It'll be fine, thanks.